Hi there, welcome to lesson 5.5. We'll be talking about fungi and fire. This is a very interesting topic and very understudied, so you're in for a treat. We'll be looking at the ecosystem effects in terms of fungal communities, but really how fire actually affects entire ecosystems and how it impacts them in the sense of reducing their biodiversity. We'll talk about more specific effects, some general rules as to how fire affects fungi, and then we'll cover the recovery process that fungi communities might go through in order to regain the ecosystem function that they had originally in the ecosystem or might arrive at a completely new fungal community as a result of fire. Okay, so this is lesson 5.5. Let's get to it. First thing we need to say here is that repeated burning destroys the soil ecosystem. Soils are some of the most complex and understudied ecosystems and have been considered to be the third biotic frontier after deep sea benthic regions and tropical rainforest canopies. So very undiscovered and very unknown, and especially when it comes to their function. About 25% of the described species live in soil. So that's huge considering that we don't know majority of the species that live in soil. And as we already know, soils hold most of terrestrial carbon. They contain diverse communities of microorganisms, but their taxonomy, or the naming and understanding of where they fit in, and their function are mostly unknown. However, the microorganisms of this living terrestrial skin drive global biogeochemical cycles and power terrestrial ecosystems. So it is absolutely essential that we do all that we can to prevent further soil degradation because it is the most biodiverse ecosystem, definitely terrestrial ecosystem, but potentially on the planet. So in this review called Fire as a Driver of Fungal Diversity, a synthesis of current knowledge from 2022, is a good start for this lesson, because it describes the various aspects that need to be considered when thinking about how fire affects ecosystems and how, in particular, it actually affects fungi. So, first of all, it basically shows that there is an ecosystem and environmental interdependence that determines the variability of fungal communities in their response to fire. Ecosystems differ, and so do the environmental conditions that vary in the fire regimes that are prescribed, as well as the circumstances within which the wildfires that might occur. And these wildfires are mostly caused by cigarette butts being dropped out the window or a piece of glass in the forest. So fires are actually very, very infrequent, but we keep thinking that they're a very frequent occurrence, but they're actually not. They're very rare naturally. Fire is not a natural process. It happens once in a million years, so to speak, when there's a lightning strike, but that's not something that happens very often. We're just used to having fires because of the conditions we've created and the way that we live, that people smoke, throw cigarette butts out the window. So it's a very strange time we live in because we actually cause a lot of fires. There's a lot of pyromaniacs out there. There's a lot of campfires that are left unattended. So this is something to clarify before we start thinking that fire is a very natural occurrence. Now, with regards to fungi, there's direct fire-induced mortality and indirect effects. Because fire changes soil chemistry and structure, it also may remove the host that the fungi depends on, as well as the substrate that it consumes. And at the same time, it alters the balance among the organism communities. So different fungi might outcompete what naturally exists if the fire hasn't gone through. And post-fire fungal communities depend on the survival of fire-resistant fungi, on fungi protected in different refugia, so where they haven't been burned, and the return of those fungi from local and distant sources of fungal spores or other propagules. Pyrophilous fungi, so those are the fungi that actually might benefit from fire, as in they are seen after fire, and they are the most frequent fungi that occur after fire because they are stimulated by fire, increase in abundance. So they start taking over the ecosystem. They are the first wave of succession they come up and lay the ground for some nutrient cycling. But that doesn't mean that these fungi require fire in order to flourish. It's just that they are opportunistic. And scientists don't still really understand this, but there are several fungi that do require either smoke for them to actually sporulate or require fire directly to be able to do that, as in heat. But they exist in the environment, and it seems that they always come up as an effect of fire being there, because that is an opportunity for them to consume what other fungi can't consume and actually didn't survive the fire. And fungal communities assembly has successional dynamics. So what this means is that, of course, as these pyrophilous fungi start transforming the ecosystem again and nutrient cycling, and everything recovers and plants drop their debris and mycorrhizal fungi kick in again, the succession starts happening over time towards recovery, towards pre-fire fungal community, if that is even possible to achieve. It just depends on so many factors, and we'll go through those factors in the next couple of slides. So this information can be described through this diagram on the right, where we can see an ecosystem will have a pre-fire fungal community, and this fungal community will have several traits like fire-responsive fungi, fire-resistant fungi, fire-resilient fungi, fire refugia, so where fungi can hide or remain unburned, and then fire-sensitive species that might lead to local extinction of these once a fire has gone through. So this community is diverse, and it keeps changing as successional dynamics of the ecosystem moves forward, but usually leading to greater fungal diversity up to a certain point. And this fungal community depends on the substrates that are available for the fungi to consume, on the hosts for mycorrhizal species of fungi, and the environment in general, such as the moisture, the type of soil, the soil microbial community, soil chemistry, physiology, the biological attributes as to the communities within the soil, and then the host removal and substrate removal when fire occurs. So all of these properties are actually changed by fire, and they are actually indirect effects. This is once a fire goes through and changes all of these attributes of the soil or the ecosystem in general. But there are also direct effects where the fire intensity will have a completely different effect on the communities of all the biota, and soil physiology, soil chemistry, and soil biology will change differently depending on the fire intensity that goes through. And this will finally affect the post-fire fungal community. And it changes the composition of this community, as you can see that the fire-sensitive species will not exist anymore in this community. And will they come back? Will they be re-established? Is there a bank of spores nearby? Will those arrive soon? What else do they depend on for their recolonization of that ecosystem? And then succession occurs through time. So this community changes, and it might go to, once again, this more biodiverse community. And this depends on the introduced organisms that might come from elsewhere where the fire hasn't come through, and the spores might travel or be dispersed by animals into the burnt areas, versus being present and surviving in the refugia that may not have been burnt, as well as being composed of those fire-resistant or resilient fungi. And of course, this changes with time as ecosystem recovery happens. But we now may have a completely different ecosystem where weeds start to take hold to start off the succession process. And with time, depending on the fire intensity, get to this stage where the ecosystem was before the fire happened. That's a whole development, several successional stages that the ecosystem might have to go through if it was severely burnt. So this is just an overall picture of what might happen in an ecosystem that experiences fire. Another great diagram from this article, Fire as a Driver of Fungal Diversity, demonstrates the various aspects of the ecosystem that determine both the pre-fire fungal communities as well as the post-fire fungal communities, how the various aspects of the ecosystems and the different conditions impact what happens during the fire based on those different aspects, as well as post-fire recovery of fungal communities. So the pre-fire fungal communities What are they like? What are the ecosystem attributes? The microbiome or the biome, the entire ecosystem, all the living things within it. What type of vegetation does it have? Does it have a huge fuel load accumulated? What type of fire goes through it and when? What are the conditions when the fire actually happens? How prone is it to fire? Is it dependent on fire to some degree? Fire and fire regime attributes. What are the characteristics of fire and the fire that man made and applied to control the ecosystem? So, what is the fire frequency, the conditions, the seasonality, the intensity, and the severity? And what are the ecosystem frameworks? What sort of diversity of fire is there, the pyrodiversity of how things will burn? The trade-based frameworks. What is this ecosystem composed of? What is the community assembly and succession? At which stage of succession is it, and what types of species exist in there in terms of plants, animals, and fungi? And what are the fungal consortia? What types of fungi exist in this ecosystem? Are they mostly decomposers, depending on succession, or are they mycorrhizal fungi? Are they arbuscular mycorrhizal, or are they ectomycorrhizal? And then once the fire is occurring, what are the direct and indirect drivers? What is the fire-induced mortality of the fungi? How many fungal species have been annihilated completely, and how many are resilient and have stayed behind? What happens to the physiology of the plants? The plants are now burnt. What are they going to be like? How are they going to recover? Do they have their mycorrhizal fungi still on their roots? Can they photosynthesize? Or is there a period where those trees are going to go through this stagnation where there's really not much life in them? What is the woody and leaf litter debris now like for the saprotrophic fungi? And what are the changes in physical and chemical environment of the soil? What are the fungi left with, and how many different fungi are there in order to deal with what's left behind post fire? There are some fungi, as I said earlier, that are pyrophilous, and these different types of fungi respond differently to fire. So, what are their categories? And you can read this paper to find out more about these different types of fungi. And what are the guild and taxon responses? So, how the different communities or assemblages of fungi, what do they look like, and how do the different taxa respond, the different species? How is it all functioning on the end of the pyrophilous fungi? And are they cosmopolitan, or are they endemic taxa? So these are all questions to be asked as to what is the fungal community like post-fire? And what are the resources and dispersal mechanisms of fungi post-fire? The local refugia that may have been left behind where fire hasn't touched them and there's some biological activity and fungal spores can actually move into the burned habitat. And what are the local propagule banks? Are they even available? Can they disperse aerially? Can spores be blown through wind and actually move across? Can they disperse through smoke plume, which is often an attribute of some of the pyrophilous fungi that actually take advantage of putting their spores into smoke plumes? All this will determine the post-fire fungal communities that are present, and how that recovery moves through the successional stages depends on everything we've just talked about in here. So it's a very complex scenario. The bottom line is that this ecosystem that we started with is no longer going to be the same, and we're losing species of all different kinds, not just fungi, but fungi are majorly understudied in terms of how they're affected by fire. So it's just something that hasn't really been looked at, and yet they are so important in driving nutrient cycling and plant succession. So without this knowledge, we actually have no idea what is going on, and we just keep losing species and losing ecosystems as a result, and putting them back in succession if they are not completely lost. And of course, they never will be completely lost. They'll just kick back from zero and kick off and restart the whole process. But that loss of that biodiversity is such a big kick to us and to the animals and everything else that relies on that ecosystem. And especially in these really crucial times that we're facing with climate change and everything else that is going on, biodiversity losses and all the things that we're facing at the moment, it's crucial to conserve these ecosystems. And you can have a read of this paper. It does talk a lot about the pyrophilous fungi, so this is something that you can learn about more from that. But we are looking at the general fungal community in this lesson. So let's look at what are the effects of fire on fungi. It really depends on fire intensity. The fungal mycelium is made up of naked fungal cells that just have cell wall around them. So they're just a carbon layer. So there is not much protection. That's why they always need moisture, and they often either in the wood or in the soil. They're always hiding. They're not just sitting there exposed unless it's really humid. So any heat is going to destroy them. And of course, besides being directly killed by fire, there are changes in soil properties such as pH and nutrient contents when fire comes through. Fire modifies the very substances it burns, it changes their composition. It removes their carbon, particularly, which fungi rely on to feed on. So it removes the carbon and puts it out into the atmosphere. So that's all the food source pretty much gone for all the saprotrophic fungi because they all rely on carbon from that wood or leaf litter source. And of course, the leaf litter is removed as well. And so many of these fungal species rely on leaf litter as their food source, as well as woody debris. And we'll talk about that later. So within the first 3 years post fire, there is generally a reduction in fungal diversity and species richness, which then stabilizes after several decades. So this really shows that successional requirement of the ecosystem, where it goes from very little diversity of fungi to then kicking in as the ecosystem comes back, as the plants grow and drop their debris and feed the fungal diversity. And of course, depending on what species come back, plant species come back, what tree species, what shrubs, and how fast that organic matter develops over time, which depends on so many factors: moisture, how much rain comes after the fire, and will everything just come back with the rain, how burnt it was in the first place, so many factors. But the general rule is that it takes decades for this recovery to occur. And there's almost always a reduced mycorrhizal fungal diversity because there is reduced host biodiversity. So the trees and other plants that have supported these mycorrhizal fungi, the different kinds of mycorrhizal fungi, may no longer exist or may be reduced in number. They may have themselves been very sensitive to fire and have not recovered well. So this all depends on the species within that community and the mycorrhizal species, what kind of hosts they require in order for them to survive and collaborate with those plants, once again, support those plants. Wildfire always causes a shift in fungal community function because the fungi will function differently based on where the ecosystem is now at. So basically, they will have a completely different function. If the wood that most of the saprotrophic fungi have relied on to feed on is now burned and they cannot access those nutrients from that wood, of course, those fungi will not be present. And now there will be other types of fungi that can actually grow on some of this burnt wood. And that does happen with some of the pyrophilous fungi. In boreal and Mediterranean forests, no mycorrhizal taxa have been observed 1 year post fire. And only after 5 years post fire have the mycorrhizal fungi returned. So, this is just to give you some examples of how drastically a fire may affect the mycorrhizal community. With increased fire frequency, there is a reduced fungal carbon sequestration. So, therefore, fire destabilizes the forest carbon sink. And this is hugely important because forests are what sequesters carbon. There's definitely some sequestration of carbon in grasslands, and there's definitely carbon sequestration in any plant community. But the greatest carbon sequestration is always going to happen in forests where trees can put that carbon deep down with their mycorrhizal roots. So it's essential that we have forests if we're going to tackle this change that we're going through. If we're going to halt it, we need to be preserving our forests, first of all and foremost, and then recovering the land back to forest ecosystems. And think about how our agricultural systems will fit into this biodiverse complex that we're going to have to sustain ourselves on. And this is going to depend on people just really understanding this concept and really driving it and really wanting that change. So, here in this beautiful image from Fungi and Fire in Australian Ecosystems, a review of current knowledge, management, implications and future directions. This image comes from this paper and it shows the different pyrophilous fungi, specific fungi that can grow post-fire. Some of them have these sclerotia underground where they've got a source of food that they can sprout from. And Australia has a lot of different kinds of pyrophilous fungi that actually do end up in an ecosystem and are more visible a lot of the times when fire goes through. So what happens with fungal recovery from fire? We know that fungal and bacterial biomass is decreased by 50% by 2-year interval burns versus 4-year interval and long-term unburned ecosystems. So that means that if we burn every 2 years, we're halving that fungal and bacterial biomass again. So we're just depleting it. We're just constantly putting it back in succession. And if we leave that ecosystem for longer, for 4 years and a long time where it doesn't experience fire, we're actually building up that fungal and bacterial biomass. And remember that fungal to bacterial biomass ratio is the key here. So we really need to actually have the fungal biomass return on a larger scale and outcompete the bacterial biomass. And this is really, really difficult because a lot of bacteria will survive fires, but fungi just will not. And so this is something that we need to think about deeply. Ectomycorrhizal fungal communities are altered in the top 10 centimeters of burnt soils versus long unburnt. And fungal biomass and fungal community recovery just depends on the spores and mycelia that are present and that have survived the fire versus recolonization from unburnt areas, which we've spoken about earlier. The greater the burnt patch, the lesser possibility of recolonization versus a small patch that's been burnt. And the bank of fungal propagules, which are the spores, the hyphal fragments, and the sclerotia, are very much the drivers of how that ecosystem will recover in terms of its fungal biodiversity. Vegetation age, fungal community succession, fire intensity, and the vectors that disperse spores, such as the animals, for example, that dig for mycorrhizal fungal foods, the effects of those ecosystem aspects remain unknown. So we just lack studies. Fire reduces nutrients, it reduces shading, so that means there's more exposure to sunlight and therefore less possibility of fungi to actually have a chance at producing fruiting bodies. There's less water infiltration into the soil. It increases erosion of the soil and causes nutrient leaching, and also increases soil heat absorption because there's lack of shading and there's lack of moisture. And the drier the soil and the more burnt the soil, the more water repellent it becomes as well. So that means that it just becomes like a desert that nothing can penetrate, where water cannot be accessed. It really causes a lot of harm to the ecosystem. High intensity fires cause tree scars, and this increases the entry of decay causing and pathogenic fungi. Because the trees that have scars that are caused by fire are suffering. They're not getting the moisture, they're not photosynthesizing because their leaves have been burnt. They're very unhealthy. So the moment there is an entry point, those fungi that are opportunistic, where the tree can't defend itself, those fungi will decompose those trees, jump in and do what their role is to do, is to decompose something that's unhealthy. So fire just causes such long-term effects and flow-on effects. And because the trees are stressed, there's greater root and canker pathogens as well. So not just on the tree trunk and on the leaves and all the above ground tissue, but also at the root zone, there is a lot of stress in the tree, causing susceptibility to diseases. There is a whole study done on that, which I might introduce later, about this increase in pathogenic fungi as a result of fire intensity and fire frequency. Okay, so we have come to the end of lesson 5.5, and in our next lesson, we'll look at the Australian fungi and fire. We'll look at a review of how the different Australian ecosystems respond to fire, and then we'll focus on two specific studies, one that was done in the monsoon tropical forests of far north Queensland, and the other in dry sclerophyll forests, and how fungi in those two ecosystems respond to fire. Okay, you shall be hearing from me in lesson 5.6. Bye for now.